Hello again, AP Euro students. Thanks again for joining me today, or tonight, I should say. I wanted to go over the decline of the church and everything that went with it, including the Avignon Papacy and the Great Schism. And this can be really kind of hard and dense to understand if you aren't familiar with Catholicism or Christianity at all. But the big thing to get out of this is that during the 14th century, the church starts to lose some of its power. And if you think about it, where does the church get most of its power? It gets its power from people's faith because people believe in it. If people stop believing in church, it loses its power because that's what religion is, it's faith. Just like Santa Claus suddenly loses all of its power in your eyes when you stop believing in him. Or a president or a leader could lose much of his power if people suddenly lost faith in him and his ability to lead or her ability. So the 14th century events really lead to a decline in the church because people start to lose faith. And a lot of this has to do with questions that people had. After all, suddenly people started to realize that the world was very complex. It was a lot scarier than they thought it was. And it seemed like the church really didn't have all of the answers that it claimed it had. So it loses a lot of its prestige and authority. Now, don't forget, of course, that the church, along with the Pope, which is the human figurehead, is the spiritual head of Christendom, meaning that it is supposed to basically be our spiritual guide, and it's supposed to have control, or a say at least, in whether our souls get to go to heaven or hell after we die. But the church was also claiming that it had temporal claims over secular rulers. So those words, temporal and secular. Temporal means earthly, temporary, something that is not divine or heavenly, meaning something that's here. Like you and I, we are temporal because we're living things that have an expiration date. Secular means non-religious or non-church. So what this means is that the church was also claiming that since kings who are secular have souls, then they also have claims or influence over kings. Basically, this means that the church is claiming that it can control everything. And it was the 14th century that made people suddenly realize maybe that wasn't a good thing. This especially irritates a lot of monarchs and kings because, after all, they were growing more powerful and they did not like that the church was challenging their own expansion of power as well. The only thing that really stood in the way of kings having total control was the church. So this really starts under the papacy of Pope Bonifacio VIII, and he has this conflict with the state. This is really the very first, I guess you could say, modern conflict between church and state. The basic question is, who has more power, the Pope or the King, over a nation of people? And if obviously, if you ask the Pope, he'll say he does, and if you ask the King, he'll say he does. So this is really a question of opinion in a way. Certainly, the people didn't get to have their opinion in this. This goes back to the Hundred Years' War once again, when King Philip IV of France, he wanted to tax the clergy during the war because he needed money, and the peasants were already taxed practically into starvation. And who had a lot of money in France? The church or the clergy. So he wanted to tax them. Bonifacio, of course, prohibited it and said you can't tax the church. It's a sin and it's illegal. So Philip IV of France gets pretty angry, especially when Bonifacio then issues this very stern papal bull. A papal bull is basically a decree from the Pope that is basically like him putting his foot down. And this papal bull, or Unam Sanctam as it was called, was the decree that the Pope has the ultimate authority on earth, even over a king. This was Bonifacio's way of saying, I'm putting my foot down. I am the one who has all the authority here, and I can even tell you, the King of France, what to do. This obviously enrages Philip, because he needs to win this war and he needs money. So this is literally a matter of life and death to him. And so he gets so angry, and especially, who is this guy? He's all the way over in Rome, and the French king, he certainly feels very powerful at this point. The story, it's kind of crazy when he actually sends an army to capture or kidnap the Pope himself from the Vatican. And they kidnap him and they take him away. But along the way, this is a crazy story, some Italian knights and nobles rescued him and take him back home. But Bonifacio was an old man, and the stress of the entire ordeal ended up literally killing him. So now they needed a new pope. And since Philip managed to sort of, I guess you could say, make his opinion known about what he thought of the papacy, he puts a lot of pressure. And I mean like intimidation, threats, that kind of thing. He pressures the College of Cardinals to elect a French pope because he figures at least if the pope is French, he might be more willing to kind of let me have my way. So the College of Cardinals does. They elect this French pope, and then Philip actually says, well, we're going to move the papal seat away from the Vatican and we're going to set him up in Avignon so he can feel more at home. He also uses the excuse that Rome was sort of unstable and had succumbed to a lot of the instability from war. Of course, a lot of that war was because of France, but that's another story. So anyway, he sets him up in the town of Avignon in southern France, which is not far from him. That way, the Pope is close enough to where I guess you could say he can control him. Many people didn't think that this Avignon papacy would last, but it ended up lasting for 72 years. And this Avignon papacy, which eventually ended up electing this other new French pope called Clement V, this Avignon papacy was known for being sort of different. And this caused a lot of problems. So why is it a problem if the Pope moves to France? Why does it matter where the Pope lives? Isn't he still a Pope? A lot of people might wonder that. But actually, it was a little bit more complex than that, as most things are in history. First of all, the Pope, not the human Pope, or like the human figure of the Pope, but the position of the Pope is very special because the position of the Pope is also supposed to be the Bishop of Rome. So the Pope is also wearing this other hat. He's the Bishop of the city of Rome itself. This is based on the idea that the Pope is actually the successor to the very first Bishop of Rome, who was the Apostle Peter, who had been the very first to spread the word of Jesus Christ to the Romans in the actual city of Rome itself. So for him to not be in Rome anymore is very symbolic and problematic for people of faith. But another big problem with the Avignon papacy is that the palace that was suddenly being built in Avignon for the Pope was pretty big and luxurious and prestigious. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Vatican in Rome, but it's a pretty nice place, a lot of gold and marble and a lot of ceremonious kind of luxury, and Avignon made the Vatican look like a shack. The Avignon Papal Palace started to resemble probably more something like a Las Vegas casino, and certainly the behavior in the Avignon Papal Palace was like that too. It was known for being very scandalous. A lot of sinful behavior went down in the Avignon Papal Palace, things that priests and other members of the clergy really shouldn't be doing. Gambling, sex, drinking, you name it. So it became seen as a sort of symbol of the church's abuse of power, that the church could do what it wanted because it was the ultimate authority, and who was going to stop it? Not to mention the fact that it was very expensive. So for a long time, the papacy was sort of seen as being a hostage of the French king. And this is a problem for a lot of people in Europe during this time who considered themselves to be faithful to the Catholic Church. So once again, who's going to save the day but another woman claiming to have visions from God, this time an Italian woman from the city of Siena. Her name is Catherine. She's now Saint Catherine, of course, and many people had tried to convince the Pope to go back to Rome. Nobody could until this woman, Catherine of Siena, claimed that God had told her that if the Pope, by this time now, it was the Pope Gregory the 11th, if he didn't go back to Rome, bad things were going to happen. And whatever she said to him, it was very successful because he agreed to return to Rome. And for that, Catherine was sainted. So in 1377, we see the papacy finally return home to the Roman city. But that wasn't the end of it. So once the papacy did return to Rome, the Pope, Gregory XI, he actually died shortly after. And by this time, the citizens of Rome, who really considered themselves sort of like the caretakers of the papacy, um, they threatened the cardinals again with violence, so with mob violence. And they said, if you don't elect an Italian Pope, there's going to be hell to pay, literally. So the cardinals did elect an Italian Pope this time, a man by the name of Urban VI, who was from Rome itself, actually. And unfortunately, though, there were some French cardinals. The cardinals, of course, are the ones who actually elect the Pope. And these French cardinals left the city of Rome, and they went back to France, to Avignon. And there they claimed that they had been coerced or forced into choosing this Pope that they really didn't want. Technically, that's true. They were forced to elect an Italian Pope, whether they wanted to or not. So these French cardinals decide that they're going to elect their own Pope, a French Pope, this time Clement the Seventh. That's a problem because now there's two popes, and you can't have two popes, of course. That's going to create some major problems. So this is sort of politically motivated more than anything else, as most religious conflicts are, and this is something we're going to talk a lot about this year. Most religious conflicts aren't really about religion. They're about politics and power, and in some cases, even geography. So this is very politically motivated because it reflects the divisions of the 100 Years' War. And you might be thinking, Italy didn't have anything to do with the 100 Years' War. And you might be right. Directly, Italy was not involved in the 100 Years' War, but they were. That doesn't mean that they didn't pick sides. So this division of having two popes, it lasts for 40 years, and it really harms the reputation and the prestige of the church, especially because it kind of turns them into a laughingstock. So again, going back to these political divisions over the 100 Years' War, so think about it. Pope Urban VI, he was Italian, and people feel very proud of a lot of times the Pope is Italian, and Italians have always felt very proud of that, especially Northern Italians. But this Pope was supported by England. England had a very important relationship with Northern and Central Italy based on trade, of course. Germany, or the Holy Roman Empire, which it's the Holy Roman Empire, so of course they are very much tied to the papacy, and also Scandinavia, they support this Italian Pope, especially because they really don't have a whole lot of love for France. On the other hand, Pope Clement VII, who is French, he was of course supported by France, and France has its own allies. Spain, for example, Scotland. You might be wondering, what does Scotland have to do with this? Scotland hated England, and so they would take whatever the opposite side was. Scotland was therefore, because Scotland was enemies with England, they always sided with France at this point. If you ever seen Braveheart, you'd understand. And southern Italy also sided with the French, mainly because parts of southern Italy were actually ruled by the French throne, as you might remember. So this is really, like I said, a very political division more than anything else. Okay, so how did people react to the schism? There were a lot of revolutionary approaches at this point. Many people thought that they could try to solve this through scholarly essays and conversations and sort of academic points. And one of those was a man by the name of Marsilio of Padua. He was a religious scholar, and he wrote this document called The Defender of Peace, And he says that, in this document, he says, there's always going to be a conflict between church and state. Go figure. So it's best to separate them. Now, that concept, the division of church and state, is something that we still argue over today. But it is actually one of the cornerstones as well of American government. So Marsilio of Padua says, it's just easier if we simply just have the church deal with church matters and the king deal with king matters. The church does not have temporal authority, it just has spiritual authority, so therefore it should just stick to spiritual matters. He also makes this very important point that the church is not here to rule over the people, it is here to serve the people, to be their spiritual guide and teach them right from wrong. And the church can't do that if it doesn't know the difference between right and wrong or refuses to acknowledge it itself. Finally, he says that the Pope should not have any kind of final authority because that's way too much power for any one man to have. And how can the Pope have the answer to the problem when, in this case, the Pope is the problem? So he says that we need a general church council, like a collection of people, to form a council that will figure out this problem of who the rightful Pope is. So that idea of a council is what leads to the concept of conciliarism, or the conciliar movement. So that term, conciliarism, comes from the word council, the idea that only a general council can end the schism and reform the church for the better. It cannot be done by one man alone, even if it's the Pope. So they did call a general council in the city of Pisa in Italy, and at this council it was decided that both popes would be deposed or overthrown, and a new pope was chosen. This was sort of meant to be like a clean slate or do-over. And this new pope was Alexander V. But the problem, though, was that the two popes who had already been in power refused to step down. They just simply said, no, try to make us. And then, of course, nobody did, because that would have meant another war. So now there were three popes, and this is really bad for the church. This turns them into an even bigger laughingstock. Clearly, it makes it seem as if nobody is in charge of the church, and if the church can't even control itself, how is it supposed to be any kind of guiding force for governments and kings and for the people themselves? So finally, the person to step in is the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, who is Sigismund, and he oversees this new council at Constance, since the Council of Pisa had been a big flop. And he just kind of puts his foot down and says, okay, all three of these popes are deposed, and we're just going to pick a new one, and this will be Martin V of Rome. And that was in 1431, and somehow that worked. The Holy Roman Emperor, who really seemed to not have a whole lot of authority in other things, apparently makes it so that this new council at Constance is somehow effective. So that was it. The Great Schism ended, and a new pope was chosen. But by that time, it was too late, and the harm had already been done. The church had lost a lot of prestige, since it had been sort of a mockery of itself. The church also lost a lot of faith because of the plague, because many people, during times of tragedy like the plague, they turned to the church to help them with healing and guidance. And obviously the church couldn't do anything about the plague, so many people just kind of figured, well, turns out maybe the church isn't that powerful. People also questioned God and how he could let such things happen. On the other hand, some Christians became ever more preoccupied with death and more obsessed with salvation, since death was all around them, and they started to believe that if they could perform good works like charity or giving money to the church itself, or simply just trying to be as good as possible in the hopes that they could sort of, rack up points, so to speak, that would actually somehow help them get through the gates of heaven after they died. This focus, this emphasis, and this obsession on salvation and getting to heaven led the church to do something else, which was to sell indulgences. An indulgence is a ticket to heaven, so to speak. An indulgence is when a person goes to church to confess their sins, and the priest or friar in charge says, okay, you are forgiven, here's your penance, and tells them to say a certain amount of Hail Marys and Our Fathers, which are prayers. But then also, you have to pay a certain amount of gold or money. Now, Basically, what you're doing here is you're selling someone an entry into heaven. You're making them pay money for forgiveness of their sins. Most people would see a problem with this. The church did this as a way to earn money. Now, the church had actually always sold indulgences, but after the years of the Avignon Papacy, which uh, had really drained their finances, they needed more money. So sometimes the church would also give indulgences, like in exchange for military service, like they did during the Crusades, when they convinced Christian soldiers to enlist in the military and go fight in the Crusades. And they were told if they died fighting those wars, they would be automatically forgiven for all sins and go straight to heaven. So indulgences can work that way too. But this seemed to be kind of corrupt and sleazy. This will become a big deal later on to some people in the 1500s. Okay, so how does religion change then in this age of adversity when the church seemed to be coming under attack? Some people reacted by clinging to this idea of mysticism, which is the idea that you can have an immediate experience of oneness with God, where God can literally speak to you or come to you in a vision and give you a prophecy of some sort or some kind of personal advice. A lot of people of various religions claim to experience some sort of mystic experience. And this experience of oneness, which is sometimes also described as like a feeling of paradise or ecstasy, that's not unusual in any religion. The Buddhists have a similar thing where they experience nirvana, or people can experience it through meditation, through prayer. It's not an unusual thing to have this sort of like mystical experience. So this starts to grow, especially in places in Central Europe like Germany. One monk by the name of Meister Eckhart, he was a preacher and he spread this idea of mysticism through Germany, that anybody could experience and this sort of oneness or visions from God if they lived a good life the way Jesus intended. So this movement spreads into the Netherlands, or also called the Low Countries at that time. And in the Netherlands, it became known as this group called the Modern Devotion, founded by a monk by the name of Gerard Groot. And he said that anyone can also achieve this mysticism, but in order to do so, you have to live in imitation of Christ. In other words, live like he did, poor, humble, um, without sin, try to be as perfect as possible. It can be really difficult for your average human being. Um, Also, this other group started called the Brothers of the Common Life as well, that also live these very sort of like humble, sort of trying to imitate Christ lives. It can be very difficult for people to live that way if you think about it, and think about all the temptations that human beings in general face every single day. Um, this wasn't just for the clergy either. Anyone, all the lay people who wanted to, could join this movement as well. So it really starts to grow. This is important because that is happening in Germany and the Netherlands, because it is in Germany and the Netherlands that the biggest breakaway from the Catholic Church will begin in the 1500s. And finally, one of the things we also notice a lot, and we'll be looking at this more in depth later on, is the fact that many of the mystics or people who claim to have these sort of mystical experiences just happen to be women. And they also claim that you could, for example, live completely just off of the Eucharist. The Eucharist is communion, or when people go to church, like especially any kind of Christian church or the Catholic Church, part of the ceremony is to eat bread and drink wine that is supposed to symbolize the body and blood of Jesus Christ. Many female mystics claimed that that was the most important part of church, and that one could actually experience mysticism through the Eucharist or communion. And there are a lot of ideas and theories as to why more women than men experienced mysticism. It could be that women tended to have their voices heard when they claimed to have a mystical experience. In other words, most people didn't really usually listen to women, but they did if they claimed to have visions from God. Another thing could also be that women were seen as more emotional, and having a mystic experience is a very emotional one as well. No one really knows for sure, but we will be looking at mystical the female mystique, female mystical experiences later on. So now another thing that changes as well is the idea that faith could also be sort of um, in collaboration with reason. The idea that you don't have to have one or the other. Many people did try to sort of veer away from faith when they started to question the church and question God, but there were a lot of religious scholars like Thomas Aquinas or William of Ockham that sort of challenged these views from the Middle Ages. And they said that, look, if you're looking for scientific proof that God exists, you may not find it, because God is something that you need to have faith to believe in. Your religious truth relies on your faith and not necessarily in science. However, this does spur scientific observation when people did try to find proof of God's existence in the physical world and therefore started to observe nature much more closely. This will lead to a whole lot of changes in the world of science. So we are going to be looking at these a little bit more in depth as the year progresses. We're going to be looking at culture next, but I'm going to stop this video because I think I went on long enough. Hopefully, though, you now understand what the Great Schism was really about in the Avignon Papacy, and how it was really about people finally really starting to question the church, and question what was really known to be true, and question the church's relationship to their government. And this is where we start to also see people really start to embrace the separation of church and state. It's not going to be for another few centuries that really gets nailed down, but this is where it really all started.